Hello, everybody. I'm Anthony Gonzalez, and I'm the program coordinator for the Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Drug Misuse Prevention and Recovery. And I want to welcome you to our continued session of using data to inform prevention planning, featuring Dr. Karen Moses. We're going to go ahead and just dive into today's content. So it's my pleasure turning it over to Dr. Moses at this time.
All right, here we go. So I will start today by beginning to tell some stories that our data, our national data through the NCHA has to tell. And here we go. Just got to find my way around the technology here. So this is a quick cartoon I think I showed in the first part of the session that it's just to show, that we've got to tell stories. And ultimately our goal in prevention is that people live happily ever after, although we define that in a lot of different ways. But, that people thrive and our students thrive. So how do we use data to get there? Well, the next few slides are going to show some national data from the NCHA 3. And this is data, as I mentioned before, from fall 2019 and spring 2020. And we're looking at the top 6 academic barriers. And on the NCHA, there are a series of questions, many questions that ask students about whether a situation, an experience, an illness, etc., has interfered in some way towards their academic progress. And in one way, it can interfere with their work for a class. And in another way, which is more serious, it can delay their progress towards graduation. And students are asked to choose the most serious. Of course, they can also choose that thing didn't happen to them or that it didn't really affect their academics at all. But here is what we see, a picture that begins to tell this story, that our students indicated that procrastination, chronic health conditions, depression, stress, anxiety, and finances had delayed their progress towards graduation. Now, these numbers might seem rather low to you, but let's look at what happens when we look at all these numbers together. So of the top 6 academic barriers, if students experienced one or more of them, that brings our percentage of students that are experiencing significant challenges with one or more of these barriers to 12.5%. So just over 10%, or 1 in 10 of our students nationally who took the NCHA say that one or more of these top 6 academic barriers delayed their progress in working towards their degree. So that's significant. That's telling us that these are serious barriers that are impacting students' retention and progress towards graduation. Now, as I mentioned in the first part of this session, we want to look at the subpopulations that are affected. And so this slide then shows us that while the aggregate, 12.5% of the aggregate student population experience one or more of the top 6 barriers, resulting in a delay in their progress towards graduation, that in fact students in recovery, I'm starting clockwise, students in recovery, that is 26.5%. Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students, 24%. Disabled students, 22.6%. And so on, we see around this around this circle. So we're showing here that for many groups, this suite of barriers is having an even more serious and significant effect on their academics. So that gives us information about what we might be able, which groups we might be able to do selective or indicated types of prevention work with. Now, we're going to move into looking at distress, and so that we can pair this up with our prevention work. So serious psychological distress affects serious psychological distress affects 17.7% of our students. And you can see that how that works out with low and moderate levels of psychological distress. Now, when we look at alcohol and other drug indicators, and we compare that, or we look at when students in recovery, almost 30% indicate that they're experiencing serious levels of psychological distress. Students who use cannabis, 23%, students who engage in underage drinking, 20%, students who engage in high-risk drinking, 19%, and then again, the aggregate, 17.7%. So you can see that those who are using alcohol in a high-risk way or using cannabis or in recovery are experiencing serious psychological distress more so than the aggregate student population, so the rest of the students. And what I want to say is that the serious psychological distress really comes from a series of questions on the NCHA-3 that it's a 6-question instrument to determine the level of psychological distress called the Kessler 6. Now, I want to get very specific about students in recovery. We saw in some slides in the first part of this session and how students in recovery fare in regard to other issues. And I just wanted to pull them out in particular because in my analysis of the data, I have seen over and over again that students in recovery are a group of students that we ought to be paying very, very close attention to and building programs and services that support them through their college life and beyond. So what we see here, as a reminder, almost 2% of students who took the NCHA identified as a person in recovery. And then I wanted to mention that at ASU, I asked a couple of additional questions about whether students have experienced, whether they've previously been in treatment for alcohol or other drug addiction, or whether they are currently in treatment for alcohol or other drug addiction. And then that actually increases the number of people who, what I kindly think of, could be in recovery to almost 4%. So that's a significant proportion of students. And we can actually look at our numbers with that N size with the data that we collect at ASU. However, what we're looking at right now in this slide are students from the NCHA fall 2019, spring 2020 national data. And it's, as I mentioned, it's 1.8% of those students. Now, you've had time as I've been talking to perhaps look at this data and to see that blue bar that represents students in recovery, that they are much more likely to have experienced the top 6 delay barriers than students who are not in recovery. They are less likely to say that they have a cumulative GPA of an A They are less likely to say that they have a sense of belonging. I strongly agree they have a sense of belonging to their university. They're much more likely to score positive for loneliness and for serious psychological distress. They're much more than double the percentage of students in recovery score positive for suicidality. They're more likely to have vaped a nicotine e-cigarette. They're way more likely to have smoked cigarettes, less likely to have used alcohol in the past 2 weeks or binged on alcohol in the past 2 weeks, and yet more likely to have used cannabis in the last 2 weeks. So this is a group of students that are showing signs of the challenges that they're facing in our universities. And I just am compelled to show this data to as many people as possible so that we can get on board and really begin to provide support for this group of students. Now, once we have data and we've used it to convince our colleagues that the work we do is something that they want to join in with us on, or give us money for, or give us more resources for, then this is what we want to do with the data. So I kind of got ahead of myself there for a moment. We do want to share data like this with key stakeholders because of those reasons, because it will help them to get motivated to take part in the prevention efforts that we coordinate on campus. It will help us and them to identify what actions we can take to set priorities, and then to create a plan that is comprehensive, that isn't a knee-jerk plan, or isn't a one department doing one thing and another department doing another, and nary the twain shall meet, right? But a comprehensive plan that we can use to really be successful. As I mentioned a little bit ago, telling the story with pictures is good. Word pictures are good too. If you can get interviews with students and staff who work with students and tell their story, that can be really helpful. I like to share first with people who care the most. So for example, with that recovery data, who are our faculty and staff and who work with students in recovery, and who are our students in recovery who might be interested in viewing that data and getting behind whatever work we do. Protect the data is something that's really important. We at ASU, the data that we collect, we use for planning, we use for monitoring our progress. We use for a lot of different reasons to benefit students, and we really don't want outside influences to come in and grab that data and publicize it in ways that work against the good work that we're doing. So really making sure that you're being careful about who you share the data with, and using it for the right purposes. And that if for some reason the press or the media does get interested in your data, to make sure that you include the right people from your university in responding to that, to not only protect the data, but also to protect yourself. Involve key groups in planning. Again, looking at, for example, when we talked earlier about this idea that we have a significant proportion of students who don't use alcohol. And if we're going to begin to plan more alcohol-free activities to engage them, to help them feel like they belong, then we're going to want to include them in our planning group. When we're planning to reduce high-risk alcohol use or illegal alcohol use among our students, we want to involve those students who are users in our planning so that we can plan efforts that will actually motivate them to change, or if we're planning events and activities to engage them in that are non-drinking, what is it that they would really like to do? Don't rely on our own ideas, but really rely on them. And then my last bullet here is don't wait for someone to invite you to speak to them about the data. Pick up your data, make appointments with people, and share your information with them so that you can, get that time with them and get them on board as quickly as possible. Then I always like to remind ourselves to think ahead for your next survey. So even though, for example, the NCHA at ASU, we do that annually, as soon as we're done, I'm starting to think about did we ask the right additional questions? What kinds of questions do the data make me ask? Like what's underneath this? How do we tease this out better? And if the questions that are asked aren't answering the questions that we have now, then we need to figure out how we're going to get that information. How can you get a larger sample? Do you increase your promotions for the survey? Do you, do you send out a larger invitation list, etc.? There are ways that you can get a larger sample, and typically your national surveys will give you some tips on that. And then colleagues who do surveys will be also very helpful. Incentives are another way to get that larger sample. And then what resources do you need in order to get the best use of the data? Do you need someone on your team who can analyze the data? Do you need someone who does your graphics and your info facts? I know I'm not saying that right, but who can really put together the data in a way that it's really consumable for everyone who needs to see it. Okay, so that ends my my presentation. Please contact me if you have any questions whatsoever about using data, about analyzing data, about any of the information in this set of slides, and of course, any information or questions that come up for you as you're working with your own data. My contact information is here, and I look forward to hearing from you. And thank you very much.